Can a Christian professor and an atheist New York media elite have a civil, meaningful conversation? Well, my guest and I are here today to prove that the answer to this question is yes. My guest is Adam Davidson, and he describes himself as an atheist New York media elite, of course, tongue-in-cheek to a degree. But he's written for the New York Times, the Atlantic, the New Yorker, Slate Magazine, and MSNBC, and many more. Adam, thanks for being willing to come on the channel of a Christian professor and YouTuber.
Yeah, I'm a big fan. I watch, I think, every video you do, so I'm really excited to
Oh my
be here.
goodness. I'm like super honored you'd say that. And I have so many questions I'm interested in. But given that you've seen some of my stuff, this is the first time we've had a chance to talk. Why did you reach out to me, and what would you hope to accomplish by a conversation such as this?
Sure, and as I'm sure we'll get into, I grew up in a world that there really were certainly no evangelical Christians, and almost no Christians of any kind. I grew up in Greenwich Village in New York City, in the world of artists. If anyone had any kind of faith in anything, it would almost certainly be like a spiritualist kind of faith. Okay. And a really formative experience in my life was in the early 1990s when I went to college at University of Chicago. I studied history of religion, and I did a project of trying to understand evangelical Christians because honestly, I had never met any. I didn't know anything about evangelical Christians. And I spent a lot of time at Moody Bible Institute. I got to know a lot of professors and students there. And it really was an important part of my life, feeling like I was able to engage, they were able to engage, or some were able to engage me. And I then went on, I lived in the Middle East for several years as a reporter and got to know all sorts of people whose views were very different from mine. And I really prided myself on my ability to engage people who saw the world very differently. I don't think we need to get into a lot of politics, but the last few years have been pretty tough in America. And I was feeling really dispirited about the ability of people who see differently. And I sort of stumbled on your videos, and, I think on some objective list of things, you and I probably disagree on everything. But I really like you, like as a YouTuber. I like you, and I like your ability and your willingness to, not be totally open. I mean, not, you know what I mean? Like to engage, to engage people. And, to me, it shows a confident faith, as opposed to an insecure faith that needs to crush your enemies. And I like the idea of being part of a dialogue across the aisle, so to speak. And so I was watching you one day. I watch you a lot, and I was like, I want to talk to that guy. So I sent you an email, and you responded, and I'm thrilled.
That's amazing. It reminds me that you never know who's watching these days, and that a conversation like this could come out of it. Well, let's jump right into your story. You describe yourself as an atheist. There's even debates about what that term means. So I'd love to hear from you what you mean when you describe yourself as an atheist, and why you consider yourself an atheist.
Sure. What I would say is it's not an important part of how I identify myself. It's not an important thing. I think about it because, the one weird thing about me compared to everyone in my world. So I grew up in a world of not at all religious people. I still live in a world of that. And the only difference between me and, I would say, my wife, my best friends, my parents, my cousins, is that for reasons I still don't fully understand, I'm curious, not curious in a faith way. Like, I don't want to ever say my mind's made up, but I don't have any yearning to believe in anything. I don't see it as very likely that I'm going to become a person of faith, but I'm curious about how people come to faith that's very different from mine. But other than that, I don't come from a world, and it's never been a big issue. My dad grew up in a nominally Christian home, although not a particularly religious one. And he is a pretty like being an atheist is really important to him, and he talks about it. But I don't care that much. Like, I know that to you that must be like beyond nuts, but the idea that God does or doesn't exist just isn't. I've heard you and others say it's the single most important question. I think for me, but I think for lots of people like me, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people like me around the world, it just isn't an important question. So I was actually this morning talking to my wife and saying that I think of myself as an atheist. And she's like, well, I think of myself as agnostic. My son was asking some questions. He's 10 about what happens when we die.
Wow.
And my wife's like, well, we don't know. And I was like, I think we know. And she's like, well, who knows? So, so for me, it's not that I've deeply wrestled with it and come to a precise conclusion that, William Lane Craig would be like, okay, that meets a philosophical definition. It's more like, I don't care that much. If you ask me, do I believe? I'd say I don't. I'm not even sure I understand what God is enough to know that it is a thing I could or could not believe in. It just doesn't, I don't think it, to me anyway, has ever been presented in a way that's coherent enough to believe or not believe. So that's my long-winded answer.
No, that's great. That's super helpful. Did you ever have a crisis of faith, or the sense of just a question of your faith, or it's just never really mattered to you that much through most or all of your life?
No, I've never, I did, so my dad is from a Christian family. My mom is Jewish, and I was raised Jewish, but as you probably know, a lot of Jews, the Jewish identity is really rooted in more of an ethnic or national identity. And my mom's from Israel, so it was very Israel centered. And as you probably know, most Israelis are not at all religious. I did around the time of my bar mitzvah. So when I was 13,
Okay.
I got really interested in praying in the kind of traditional Jewish way. And I even thought maybe I'll be a rabbi, but it was never about God. It was about I do really love, and we observe all the Jewish holidays, and I love praying in Hebrew. I love the ritual of it. That is very meaningful to me, but it's meaningful to me, at least to my experience, because I just think it's cool that I'm doing a thing that millions of other Jews are doing now, that my ancestors have done for thousands of years. We just had the Passover, the Seder. I find that is meaningful, but not, it's funny, Reform Judaism, at least the Reform Judaism I grew up in, God never really comes up. I mean, we say these prayers in Hebrew that mention him, but it's not really about that, at least in my experience.
So if I understand, it's just a part of the, tied to a historical tradition, tied to your family, gives identity, but that can all happen without God existing or not.
Yeah, including rituals like weddings and funerals and bar mitzvahs. Like, I want my son to have a bar mitzvah. I'd certainly, I think funerals are important, but these are human, to mark these moments. I think that's very functional and helpful for people going through transition.
Did you know any Christians growing up? Did you meet some, interact with them at school? Talk about that a little bit.
I mean, honestly, there was one family. So I grew up, I was born in 1970, and I don't know if you know Greenwich Village, certainly through the 80s, through my childhood, was really where the avant-garde, the artists lived. So I grew up in a world, and I grew up in a building that was all artists. You had to apply to live there. You got a subsidized rent. And so all the grownups I knew were painters and sculptors and dancers. My dad's an actor. My mom's been a dancer and actor. And if you imagine like people in the 60s who were kind of doing drugs and free love and all of that, some of them get married, have kids, those are the kind of the parents that I knew as a kid. And it would have, there were Jews who were like us, there were a bunch of Jews, a lot of Jews. There were a lot of people who had some kind of spiritual practice that was usually kind of honestly, in my opinion, kind of silly, but whether it's around crystals or meditation, there were a lot of culty kind of things like Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, I remember, was kind of a
Okay.
big guy around. And um, but Christian, I mean, there's one family I knew went to a church. That was it. And I would
Wow.
guess that it was like, I'm sure it was a, back in the 70s already, a gay and lesbian affirming,
Sure.
extremely progressive church. Because I just don't
Mm.
think in Greenwich Village there was anything, I can't imagine there was any evangelical churches around. I certainly didn't know of any. Now, what was interesting is my dad's family was nominally Christian, although I later learned my grandmother considered herself an atheist. I think most of my aunts and
Oh,
uncles considered themselves atheists. I just didn't know that.
wow.
And they felt a little, I mean, I loved them, I was close to them, but they felt a little different. And I thought
Mm.
of them as Christian, but it wasn't until I was a grown up and looking back that they were not going to church. They were not praying. They were not seeing Christianity as a defining. I think I saw Christianity as kind of how I saw Judaism. Like if your great grandparents were Christian, you were Christian, but there was no
Mm.
commitment to any faith. I didn't understand that till much later. So I literally didn't. I would be shocked if a single person I grew up with knew who your dad was or had
Mm.
ever, or could really articulate. Like if you asked almost all the adults I grew up with, what's an evangelical Christian? They would say that's a judgmental, homophobic
Wow.
person who just wants to take away our rights. Something like that. That would be, and I guess a lot of them
Wow.
would say that today as well.
Very interesting. Have you ever been to an evangelical church since then, just to see and
Oh, like
observe?
millions, countless. Yeah, yeah. No, no.
Oh,
I mean, this was like a real thing that I took on. I mean, when I was in college at University of Chicago, I studied history of religion, and it really was. I look back and think, I was basically training to be a journalist.
hmm.
I was like, who is the group that I don't understand, that I understand the least, and I kind of hate the most?
Wow.
And and I would have probably shared the views of
Hmm.
that evangelical Christians. What are they? They're just a bunch of judgmental, angry.
Hmm.
And so I wanted to understand. And so I both got to know a lot of people, and then also got, I learned a lot about the history of Christianity in general, the history of evangelical Christianity in America, getting a sense of premillennialism versus postmillennialism, and various you know predestination, free will. I
Sure.
got a richer sense, and I got to know a lot of people, and I remember saying like, oh, there can be a gospel of love. It never occurred to me
Hmm.
that there could be, and like any group, I learned, yeah, there are of course judgmental jerks and sweethearts, and there's every shade of human being in evangelical Christians, just as there is in any community, as far as I can tell.
So,
I should say, I then, years later, I went on to live in the Middle East, and I went through a similar journey with strict Muslims, and
mm,
Muslims who. I had a very formative experience with a young man who wanted to be a suicide bomber and who loved Osama bin
oh,
Laden, and he became a friend. He's moderated a great deal, I'm happy to say, and he's still a very religious Muslim, but he doesn't have those views. Um, and so and I have a lot of Amish friends. That's something I've
huh.
kind of pursued. So I like, you know, when people are very different than me, I like to figure that out.
Hmm.
I find that really pleasurable.
So, for lack of a better term, given that you've had a conversion of sorts in your perception of conservative Muslims and evangelicals, when you talk about this, which presumably you do with just people in your community and your friends, are they like, Adam, you have drunk the Kool Aid, you are wrong? Or is it like, oh, tell me about that? Maybe they're not so bad.
More the first. Yeah. I mean, I remember
Hmm.
in college and shortly after college when I was spending a lot of time going to evangelical Christian services, going, hanging out at the Moody Bible Institute. I know my dad was really worried, and other friends, like, they didn't have a framework for understanding that without assuming I was about to become an evangelical Christian. And I cannot right now think of anyone I've convinced to think differently about evangelical Christians. Yeah, I mean, maybe I have, but I can't. No one's leaping to mind. I mean, my wife's a very like, if you came to our house, she'd be super, you'd like her a lot, and she'd be friendly. Like, she wouldn't be like, oh, he's judgmental. But if I just asked her generically, like, what do you think of evangelical Christians? I would guess, I mean, she's going to watch this and be like, no, I wouldn't. Why did you say that? So, yeah, I think, we see the cliche, and we see the, just like, I'm guessing people like me in your world, you see the extremes, and you only see the thing we disagree about the most, right? Like, I was just watching a video today about abortion, or about, gay rights, or whatever it is. If we just zero in on the things we disagree about the most, of course, I mean, how could you not just be like, oh yeah, they're terrible? And, and I guess that, like, if I wanted something out of this, I mean, I feel like I'm genuinely hoping that there is a path to honorably sharing this nation together, that, like, even if I don't, because there is a thing that I am aware of that I think my friends are not, which is that your faith is, I think there's a tendency to look at someone who thinks differently as like a list of choices, like abortion, I'm going to choose to be against it. Gay rights, I'm going to choose to be against it. But I think that I understand that you live in your faith puts you, the way you understand the very nature of reality, the way you understand the very structure of space and time, and the very path of a human life is different. And not, I'm not judging like that.
Yeah.
And so you didn't, like, sit down and say, I think I'm going to judge people for that. You believe that the universe is structured in a particular way, that there's evidence that the world is structured in that way, that God entered history at a particular moment in a particular way and left clear information about how the world works, and that you feel like you need to live according to that. And there are implications of that lead you to come to conclusions that are different from mine. But it's the really interesting meat is, as you say all the time, was Jesus risen? Is he the risen Lord? And is what he said true? And is what his followers said true? And if it is, then XYZ. I don't think that's true. And so obviously I wouldn't go to your implications. But I think it's really hard for other people to look at that totalizing view. Just like I didn't decide, like, I could believe in evolution or not, or I could believe in gay rights or not. Those are subsequent to the core beliefs that I have.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that's why the question you cited earlier, the existence of God or not, like, these core issues play themselves out in some of these particulars. You mentioned gay rights, abortion, the environment, whatever issues we talk about. You're right, there's bigger questions that have to be answered. And at least for me and most evangelicals I know, it's not a pick and choose. It's more of a thoughtful, begin with, does God exist? Has he revealed himself? What does it mean to be human? And these play themselves out in ethical and political ways. Let me jump back if I can. You said you haven't had any luck, if I don't remember if you used that word or not, but haven't converted anybody in kind of your camp, so to speak, to view evangelicals differently. Not that I would think you would give a dishonest answer, but I don't want exactly what you think about this. Why do you think the perception of evangelicals is as it is within your community? And of course, we could flip the question and say, why does the Christian community view your community in this fashion? But is it on the side of like, oh, if more people in my community would just understand Christians the way I do, that would narrow down some of the misunderstanding? Or is it like, you know what, Christians really do have these issues and actions that you've seen as you've gotten closer? Or is it both?
I guess both. I think, I mean, first of all, like, it is hard for me to convey how, I'm just going to talk frankly while afraid I'm going to insult you, but how irrelevant evangelical Christians are to the world I come from. They're just not, they're not around. I moved to Vermont from Brooklyn at the end of the pandemic, but there actually was a Bible believing church. The guy went to Bob Jones University. He was a true, Southern Baptist all the way. Okay. And his church, he's had a mission in Brooklyn for 30 years, 40 years. I mean, it's kind of I went to his church once just to check it out. It was right on my corner. There are like 6 people there. He is not planting seeds. Like, it is, in my world, I worked at NPR, National Public Radio, and there was a woman, she was actually a Mormon, but she told me, there are Christians here. They just don't admit it. They only tell me because when I worked at NPR's New York bureau, no joke, there were 3 practicing Wiccans, so witches.
Okay.
And as far as I know, 0 practicing Christians, and a whole bunch of Jews like me, like secular Jews. So first off, like, there's next to no overlap. Like, we literally never interact. Like, I think I emailed you that I don't think I've ever knowingly, organically met an evangelical Christian. In other words, I do know a lot of evangelical Christians, but I went out of my way to find them. That's not entirely true. There's been, like, I can think of a couple people I've worked with who sort of, once they learned that I was cool with it, they told me they were Christian. But so there's probably more than I know, but it's hidden, and it's but it's not like we're not thinking about you. It's not a topic of conversation. It's not, other than these moments of, frankly, what feel like interference, So certainly in the 80s, the various televangelist scandals, I think Jerry Falwell Jr., those scandals, we learn about that. Obviously all the political stuff of the last few years, and earlier, I mean, for years and years and years. And now, all that being said, the world I grew up in is incredibly gay. So I grew up in Greenwich Village, where I was trying to do the math the other day. I mean, I would guess 40% of the men I knew as a child were openly gay, something like that. I mean, it's all artist housing, Greenwich Village. My dad was an actor. Certainly a very high percentage. I mean, it was utterly normal. It was not notable in any way. And so when you hear, all right, when the only information you have is they're frauds who are trying to steal money from their followers, and they have these jets and, the prosperity gospel stuff, or they seem to really want to bum out my friends and make their lives worse. If that's all the information you get, and then 99% of the time you're not even thinking about them at all, I think that's a recipe for judgment and understanding and caricature.
It makes total sense if there's not relationship there to just soften or fill in the gaps and give some context, and this is the narrative you have, that makes perfect sense. Now, you don't get worked up like some of the so-called new atheists. That movement has kind of died, so to speak. People like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, even though they're still having a huge influence. Why don't you get worked up in the same fashion as many of the outspoken atheists have been over the past maybe decade or two?
If you really embrace the scientific method, if I define the scientific method as, off of Immanuel Kant, like we can't know the truth directly. We can only know the truth, through a process. But the process approaches the truth, but it can never reach the truth. Like truth is always elusive. You always know that whatever finding exists today, there's going to be a better finding in the future. It makes any form of intense certainty feel sort of beside the point and weird. Okay. And then there's also a kind of don't be a jerk rule. Here we are sitting, I think, I want to say this in a nice, I think you're wrong, right? I think Sure. that you have a belief system that is, I did study, and I'd love at some point to really go into it with you. I speak Hebrew, I speak Arabic, I've studied the texts, and I'm pretty, I feel like I'm informed, unpersuaded, as opposed to just, I don't believe it. I've actually looked at it. But I don't know that I want you to not believe. That doesn't feel like my job or something okay. I want. So, and your belief doesn't bother me. I do think certainty that leads to legal outcomes, that does concern me. I am very concerned about some of the laws being passed to prevent certain ideas being taught or books being taught. I that's a point where I would want to use the political sphere to advocate. Sure. But faith, I see faith as a really good, I think we as humans want faith. We want, and faith, we are sense-making beings. Our brains need to tell a story about how the world works. And that story deeply influences, how we are in a family, how we are in a society, et cetera, et cetera. And so we're going to do that anyway. And we're all going to be wrong. We're all going to be wrong. In my view, no one's right. They're not right and wrong. We're all wrong. And so I guess my worldview would be, so let's be cooler with each other about our differences. Okay. Now, where I do get crazy judgmental, and if you follow my Twitter feed, I get furious with people inside my world. I'm very upset about NPR and the New York Times, not even over political things necessarily, but journalistic things. And so that's where I get really the people who are most like me. It's I have friends who are Hasidic Jews, and it's the people who to all of us look exactly the same. Their hats are just a slightly different size, or Amish people. You could meet an Amish guy who's oh, that guy's not Amish. I hate that guy because his hat's, the brim of his hat is too long or too narrow. So I do get worked up about my people. And I do get really mad at, certainly Westboro Baptist Church or, sure. The kind of hate-filled, but you probably get madder at them than I do, I would guess. So
Definitely.
Yeah. But I don't, I probably agree with a lot of what Christopher Hitchens says, for example, but I don't see the point of if I came to Biola, my goal would be to understand what's going on, and I'd be curious, but I wouldn't, let's just say I gave a speech and, 30 students were yeah, I'm leaving, I'm no longer a Christian because of Adam's speech. I wouldn't feel happy about that. That would feel kind of a bummer to me.
Good. That's super helpful. Now, you watched one of my interviews you shared with me with Drew McCoy, who his YouTube name is the Genetically Modified Skeptic, friend of mine who, if anybody watching hasn't seen the story, was in a conservative Christian faith, left it, and experienced a lot of hurt and pain from Christians around him as he was leaving. Your story seems totally different from that. How would it compare and contrast with his? And in fact, would you experience a similar kind of pushback if you left, so to speak, the community that you're a part of and did become a Christian?
Yeah. So first of all, I think he's awesome. I mean, I've never met him, but I love his videos. I find he has such a human, thoughtful, obviously. I probably agree with him on a lot of things that I would disagree with you on, although I
Sure.
put you both in a similar box as far as thoughtful, reaching out to others. So I just want to say that. Yeah, let's say I did an altar call and I accepted Jesus and I became an evangelical Christian, it would, it'd be a major crisis in my marriage, no question. It would be, my son would be beyond upset. My dad, I don't know how he would deal with it. It would be a real major crisis. I think, that how I performed with, if I was trying to share the good news with everybody, I would lose all my friends. I guess if I just kind of kept it to myself, it wouldn't be as big a deal. Although if I started making, if I openly oppose gay marriage, for example, or which I want to be clear, I don't oppose gay, just to be very clear. I think that's obvious, but it would be a major crisis. I don't think I think there's a version of that where it would be kind of as bad as Drew. I see it as slightly different because it's not that I come from a world of a very specific set of commitments that they expect everyone to adhere to. I could say I'm on a journey. I think Jesus is cool, like a progressive Christian journey, that would be fine. I could probably do that with Islam or Judaism, and I could definitely do it with, if I did it with Buddhism, that would be like totally, not even notable. Everyone does that. But so it would be like how much of a commitment. You can look at David Mamet, the playwright, who he hasn't, as far as I know, become a Christian, but he's become fairly aligned with a far more conservative political ideology. And he's pretty done as a, he also seems like not the easiest guy to get along with. And I don't know how many, even in his liberal days, I don't know how popular he was. But so, yes, it would be a major life change, like relationship ending, relationship redefining crisis. Especially if I like friends of mine who have come to faith, in those early days when it's all you can talk about, like that would be like, I feel like you could come into my world and you do have a confidence. And if people asked you, you'd tell them your faith. But my instinct is you wouldn't be at the dinner table being like, let me tell you the good news. And so it's not like you'd be ostracized, or I think you'd be treated in a very nice way. But it would, but yeah, if I started being an outspoken, like if I started speaking on the 700 Club or something, like that would be, I think I would just be completely ostracized, I think.
So what, in some ways you kind of answered this, but what advice would you give to evangelicals like myself and others who the nature of our view of the world is evangelism, and there's a lot at stake in what we believe, who would say, you know what, we want to lovingly reach out to people like Adam and his friends in the media and his community. What advice would you give to me and Christians?
So I do think you're doing quite a good job, obviously, because although I don't know that anyone I know knows who you are, so maybe I'm an outlier.
That's fine.
That's not to put you down. It's just to point out the goal. I think a mission of living a model life is the most effective. And I've seen you kind of, I mean, this was not, I want to be clear, like, this is not the, let's talk about how awesome Sean is and you never, but I do think there's a reason I'm on this and not some other YouTube channel. I've seen you publicly wrestle with some thoughts about, like, how do you both believe that it is in the nature of reality that a man and a woman should be matched, but also it is in the nature of reality to be loving to people and that we're all fallen. And I think seeing that wrestling in public, seeing moments of, it's not uncertainty, because I think you are pretty certain about where you're going to end up, but there is a compassion, there's a humanity there. I do sometimes, there's one interview you had recently, and I'm trying to remember who it was, where the person was like, here's what God wants. He wants this, and he wants this, and he wants this. And I was like, how do you know? Like, why are you talking like that? Like, you don't know that. And what do you base that? Like, and I find that frustrating. Another thing I find super frustrating is stop explaining who we are. And so, I mean, you did have a video fairly recently about what secular people believe, and that secular people believe it's all based on our feelings. And I was like, no, that's just wrong. Like, you don't, like, I shouldn't have a YouTube channel where I explain what evangelical Christians believe. Like, it just, why do that? Or that, we all just want to have sex and sin, and that's why we reject God. Like, that's just not our experience. So, I feel like I've done the work, or at least some of the work, you could always do more, of understanding the lived experience of an evangelical Christian, understanding, and the many different, it's not, there's not one group, as there's many, many, many that fall under that heading. So just know us a little better. Another thing that I find super off-putting is sometimes the feeling that that things like love and deep meaning and deep purpose are a Christian experience. I think my love of my wife, my love of my son, the purpose I get out of my work is very deep and very real. Now, you can, obviously, you're free to believe that there's a whole other level of love and purpose that I have not yet touched, but that does not mean I don't have it. And I know that many Christians have periods where they struggle with love and purpose. And so I think, so be a model of what it is you of the strength you get, but be far more uncertain about your certainty about us and what our goals are, what our purposes are. And then I do think, and this is true of every group, it's I don't know, I'm from the media. I know why the things we hear about are the extreme outliers. Like, that is the nature of media. So I don't know, there's not going to be a front page story. Boring, normal apologist professor has a nice dinner with his family and hangs out with a secular guy. Like, that's right. That's not going to be an article. But anyway, I a little bit lost track of where I was going.
No, that's great. You were talking about authenticity, relationships, represent another side fairly, not overstating your case. These are great, super valuable points for me and for my audience. And it kind of, I have a question for you, but at some point it'd be interesting to come back to. I don't think a Christian would say, at least a thoughtful Christian, that an atheist can't experience love and meaning. I think we would be back to the question we asked before. In a world without God, can there be things like love and free will and value? So obviously we can't answer that right now, but that's what I think a thoughtful Christian would say. I can't imagine anybody would look at you and say, yeah, your marriage doesn't have value, your writing doesn't have value. That's crazy. Of course it does. I would be asking the deeper question, what is value, what is meaning, and do we have that in a world without God? So that would be just some clarification where I would be coming from, but that's something we could tackle in due time. I'm interested in what else, and maybe you covered this. What misunderstandings do you think Christians have about the secular world? In fact, do you even like the title, The Secular World, or is there another title you would prefer to describe it?
Yeah, I don't think, other than talking to you, I don't think of myself as living in the secular world. That wouldn't be a word I would ever use to describe myself. I think that, so that would be, I think that's true whenever you're engaging another group, is understanding that it's very variable, and even among like my closest and dearest friends, there's a range of views about, is there a place for a God or some kind of spiritual dimension to the world? We're nowhere near, I don't think anyone's anywhere near your conception of God, but there's a pretty wide range, and I know a ton of practicing Buddhists and others. But then there's also a wide range of views on, like, say, drugs. I don't do drugs. I smoked pot in high school and college, but I've never done it since. My life is has always been very monogamous, very, I do have people in my life who are very actively, some in very destructive ways, some in just, that's how they want to live their life, so there's a range, like we ourselves have a big range on how we view, for lack of a better word, sin. I don't use the word sin in my life, but sinful behavior. When one of my friends, when I learn that someone I know has cheated on a spouse, I find that really upsetting, and I judge them for it, even though I don't, believe in the Bible. So there's a lot going on out here to the evangelicals, and there's a lot of different folks with different views. Just like I try and explain to my friends, you can't think of, as you've said, if you really go down the list, there might be 6%. We see the world like, oh, we live in this big Christian country, everyone's Christian, and we're the ones who aren't Christian. But you see it as no, like a very small number really have the informed, thoughtful commitments that you define as Christian. And so anyway, so that's one thing. The other thing is, I would guess, I just talked about how not open we are to Christians. We're definitely not open to, or I can't think of many people I know who are open to a mission, like an explicit mission as mission. Like, hey, let me tell you the good news. Here's a comic book, or here's a cartoon of, that kind of thing. We laugh about that when we get, but if you came to my house, you'd have a great time, and you could spend and if I told all my friends, he's literally a professional apologist for Christianity, and they'd be like, oh, he's cool, I like him. Like it's and my guess is that would happen if I came to your world. Like, people tend to be way less jerky when they're actually engaging with people. If I told everyone I'm thinking of inviting an evangelical Christian apologist, they'd be like, ugh, that doesn't sound fun. But then they'd meet you and they'd be like, that's cool, I like that guy. So that there is and maybe more of a one-to-one openness, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's interesting when you're talking earlier about your perception and many of your friends of Christians shaped by certain televangelists and political movements. I'm listening going, oh, this is making me cringe because this doesn't represent so many in our group. You watch evangelicals that are like, yeah, I'm not sure that really represents how I think. So the reality is we probably both do it to a greater and lesser degree,
Yeah.
put people in a box, simplify things. And that's something that if we really, like you said, want to live in a community where there's peace between people, all of us can do that better, so to speak.
Yeah. Sam Harris almost never comes up in my life. Like, nobody talks about him. Richard Dawkins. Like, it's not like we're sitting around, like, according to the book of Sam Harris. Like, I've never read one of his books. Like, I've never, like, I think I've seen some interviews, but it's not like I'm pursuing or Richard Dawkins or any of that. We're not defining ourselves as we're against Christians. Like, that's not even, we're not, like, it's almost like giving Christians too much credit in our world. We're not thinking enough about you. It's like, I'm not defining myself as, I'm not Azerbaijani, or, I'm not a volleyball player. Like, it's just not a thing I'm thinking about. And I happen to be an outlier in that because for whatever reason I'm interested, but it just doesn't come up very often in, the other thing, and this is a trickier thought, just it's not that, it's just I haven't fully thought it through, but recognizing what I said earlier, that so that you have this fundamental commitment to a view of the world. Mm-hmm. You look at evidence, and when you talk through the evidence, it is more tentative than I think sometimes others give it credit for. Like, there's all the Bart Ehrman stuff of really going deep on when was this written, when was that written, which tablet, which text. And then, so if if the latest archaeological find or whatever showed, I don't know, whatever, a lot of your commitments, since they're downstream of that fundamental view of the world, and that a lot of people don't have that fundamental view of the world, to me, it should give you more compassion, and you seem to have compassion. I'm talking about you in the generic sense, or more understanding of why we would have the views we have, because it would just make sense that, all right, but what if he wasn't risen, and what if the Bible isn't true, or what if we find that argument pretty uncompelling? Then we wouldn't end up at, marriage is only between a man and woman, or abortion and murder, or,
I actually totally agree. And I mean, this is a compliment. You are preaching to the choir in the sense of, I thought if I didn't hold these certain views, I would view this on marriage, or I'd maybe approach this politically differently because of the core issues. And so, well said. I love that you articulated that. I asked this question to Coleman Hughes, who's just a young, super thoughtful thinker, one of my favorites. And I said, he's an atheist. Is there anything about the world that gives you pause, that makes you think, God, maybe there is a God? And he said consciousness, in the sense of it's just such a mystery to explain how some evolutionary material process spawns consciousness. And then he talked about how just the value of religion, if I remember correctly, just societal health, emotional health, there's something about believing in God that he doesn't feel like the secular world has been able to replace. Those are his two things. Is there anything to you that gives you pause, like just occasionally you think, I wonder if that's actually a something that points to God?
I mean, I would say, there's a fairly comprehensive series of thoughts from Kant through a lot of study of consciousness to realize our brains are working really hard to structure reality in a way that makes it useful for us, and that we are not seeing the world. And I find it almost impossible to actually believe that. I feel like, even though we're in this ridiculous, we're on the opposite sides of the country talking into video cameras, I still feel like I am looking at you and you're, but that our brains are constructing reality in an ongoing way. And this was so it's not just consciousness, it's the full understanding of how the mind works and all the work the mind is doing, both to choose how to frame things, how to reduce things, that makes me, and then you add to that, our brains and our bodies, we might linguistically differentiate between logic and feelings, but they really are, there's a lot of work going on inside, a lot of chemistry, a lot of electricity. That's, the world is out there, and then my brain is taking in a world that is ordered in a way that is really just telling us about the brain. It's not telling us about what's out there. And so that leads me to a fundamental, like, it's not like when they figure out how to reconcile quantum physics with Einsteinian relativity, we're going to finally have the answer. We're never going to have the answer. And if we do find intelligent life on another planet, they're going to have a totally different framework. So that gives me like profound modesty about even the possibility of certainty, which is kind of funny, because if you ask most people who know me, I seem like I'm always certain about everything, even if I'm certain today about the thing that I totally disagreed with yesterday. But I still, for me, fundamentally, I don't know how to think about God. I don't know what that means when you say that word. Like, I literally don't know what that means. I don't know what it would mean for there to be this entity that is outside. Like, even if you showed me, no, look, we now have full proof that this brain or this entity designed this universe, I'd be like, yeah, but that's still part of the, I really fundamentally don't get what you're talking about when you say God, believe it or not. And I'm somebody who's, I have a degree in history of religion. I've spent, 35 years studying it fairly on again, off again, but fairly seriously. I don't know what you mean by God. So it's not even a concept, which both maybe leaves a little bit of a gap that somebody could define it in such a way where I'd go, oh, okay, yeah, maybe I do believe that. But on balance, I would say, I've spent a lot of time talking to a lot of Christians. I think I've heard all the all the apologias, all the arguments, and I'm just fundamentally, my degree is really in ancient Near East religions, and I'm now working with some Assyriologists. I'm doing a project that deals with ancient, much older, old Assyria, so 2,000 years before Jesus. Wow. And, the story that makes sense to me is there was this big worldview that had a set of myths, and in kind of one little corner, there was a group that adopted those myths in a certain way. And so I have a story I tell that I'm persuaded, but at the end of the day, I'm not persuaded that it's possible to be fully persuaded. I don't know if that means, so there's a space for God. I'm not sure I would think that, but it definitely means there's a huge space for, I know for sure I'm wrong in the sense that you can't be right.
In some sense, yeah, fair enough.
In some sense, yeah. So consciousness is just one dimension of mind. And a lot of the literature is that consciousness might be the least interesting thing going on in the mind. It's kind of this pretend thing at the very end of a thought process that gives us the impression that we're conscious, but that what's really going on is total weird chaos. But yes, mind is where I go. And then, when you touch on the vastness of the universe, it is I believe in the Big Bang, of course, and I believe in evolution. I believe in all of it, but I can't really take in billions of years and, hundreds of billions of galaxies. It's too much. It's unimaginable. It's crazy.
I super appreciate your honesty in all of this. And by the way, earlier when you said, I don't want to offend you, we don't think about evangelicals a lot. Your tribe is irrelevant to us. That didn't insult me. That is fascinating to me. I was like, wow, just have an insight. And also that the idea of God for me, if I'm going to talk with somebody, I assume they understand what I mean by God, but there's some legwork we would have to do first to make sure we're even talking about the same thing. So just bringing this to the surface is super helpful to me.
Yeah.
I've
will say, sorry.
Go
Sorry.
ahead.
It feels to me like a lot of Christians are kind of obsessed with us. That could be wrong, but that's what it feels to me like that. There's a really strong view that there's this group of secular people, and particularly people like me, like coastal media elites, who have a plan and want to destroy. Like it's a,
Yes.
And so in my mind, there's a contrast there that we don't think about you, but it feels like you're thinking about us a lot.
That could be true, and I think it's arguably maybe where the primary voices of influence are coming from, university, the media, etc., that makes it easier in your group to ignore us and not think about it, but a lot harder for Christians to ignore it.
Right.
Although that's potentially changing now, which is a whole nother conversation.
Right.
I was going to say earlier, it's interesting, and this is another topic, we could explore it sometime, but I don't really approach questions of faith through the question of certainty. I'm not certain that Christianity is true. I personally approach it through the lens of am I confident and do I have reasonable confidence? Because if my goal is certainty, I'm not going to know anything in a Kantian sense, let alone that God exists. That's more how I approach it. I have a couple questions for you. So let's focus. I have two more for you, and then I want to know if you have any questions for me. I'd be interested in what you'd want to ask me. But back to, you said it feels like our group is obsessed with the media and with the elite. I've been interviewed by CNN a few months ago, New York Times a couple times. I've had some interaction and have always been treated charitably and kindly. But every publication, there was a certain slant. I'm like, yeah, this is being presented in a way that I don't think captures really what happened, with an agenda, so to speak. And maybe agenda strong. Maybe it's just from the worldview of how CNN, New York Times see things. They present it through that lens. But because of my experience with the media, my guard is up, and it's so easy to feel like there is kind of a larger agenda. And, we could play that out politically. We don't have to get into some of those issues. But am I justified in feeling that, especially given the way you described that you don't know really anybody else, any Christians in journalism, and those who are sympathetic towards Christians? Piece these together. Doesn't it make sense that my tribe, at least to a degree, would be suspicious and on the defense?
Yes, I think it does. And I do think it is not an agenda. It is not a political agenda, an economic agenda. It is a worldview issue and an ignorance issue. So, I'm very much for gay marriage. I want to be clear. But when I was at NPR and we were covering gay marriage, I was observing that, as far as I could tell, nobody even knew anyone who was against gay marriage. And it's not, I don't believe we needed to cover it in a 50-50 way, or we had to cover both sides. I'm not even saying that. I'm just literally saying we should just know. I covered the Iraq War. I was in Iraq for a year, and I felt that more journalists should engage the military. It doesn't mean we have to join the military. It doesn't mean we have to agree with every choice the military makes, but we should know the stuff we cover. This has been a big issue in the last few years. So yes, I don't think there's an agenda. I don't think we want your children to be gay, or we want socialism, or we want you to stop believing. But I do think, I've worked at NPR, New York Times, New Yorker. I've been on MSNBC a lot. I've been on CNN a lot. I know, I'm right in the midst of the immediate elite. And I think they're earnest, hardworking people who really almost all want to pursue the truth. That is genuine. I think if you came to the Times, you'd be like, holy crap, these people work really hard and they're really committed. I think they just don't know. It is a worldview they don't know. And I think it's very challenging to write about it in a way that wouldn't, I sent you some of my writing. I like to think I've done a better job than most. Like you wouldn't see what I wrote and think, is he a Christian or not? But you would read it, and I think I hope I'm not mocking, I'm not dismissing, I'm not insulting, but that's a lot of work. That took me years to do. And I'm not going to send like all of journalism through years of evangelical Christians and then years of understanding.
Sure.
So yeah, I think it's a deep issue. I do, but I don't think it's a deliberate issue, I guess is my point.
Okay. Fair enough. So last question, and you can obviously answer this to your level of comfort, but at the beginning you mentioned your son who's 10, and I have 2 high school kids, and I have a son who's 9 who'll be 10 in a few months, and I'm sure they get together and not talk politics and just have fun being kids, all of these differences aside. But I talk with my son. He asks me similar questions. Does God exist? What happens after you die? As an atheist, how much do you think about that? I've heard it said that one of the core philosophical questions, not just religious, in the East and the West, is to make sense of death and to cope with it. So how does that fit into your world? Do you think about it a lot? Do you not think about it? How would you talk to your son who's 10 about a question as deep as what happens after we die?
Yeah, it's actually literally this morning for the first time. My wife said he was asking like, what happens after we die? My wife's dad died recently, and our son was asking, what happens? Thanks. And so literally today I was like, oh right, we got to think about that. And I do think there's a way to talk about it, even if I don't believe we'll see Gampy again. I don't believe there's an afterlife. By the way, Jews don't really, in a rich way, believe in an afterlife either. There's some Jews emphasize a messianic age, but I was raised in a Judaism that really doesn't have an afterlife either. But I do think I would want to focus on there's ways of making meaning during your life. The fact that our life is so brief is actually part of what makes it so beautiful and meaningful, even if he and I were talking the other day about life on other planets. He's obsessed with the idea of life on other planets and saying, if we're the only intelligent life in the universe, that's unbelievable. Like, we're the ones who get to actually consciously think about the universe. That's amazing. And if we're not the only intelligent life in the universe, that's also amazing. That's so cool. We can, so that meaning comes through all sorts of things, a personal mission in life that might adjust, and kindness. And so I do think I have things to talk to him about, but I also think it is just, I don't think about death that much, although since I turned 50, I am aware that I'm on the other side of something, and I think it's fundamentally scarier to not believe in an afterlife than, although hell sounds pretty bad, but if I, in that sense, I think it would be better to be able to tell him there's heaven. But that, since I don't think it's true, it would feel like lying and manipulating. Like I might as well tell him. So, but it's a deep, okay. But I think that's a human issue, right? Every human being has to confront it one way or another.
I agree. So thanks for sharing that. Super interesting. Yeah. Well, to wrap up, I'm curious, what question would you have for me, if any?
I mean, I have a million questions. I mean, I do think, like, I almost feel like I'd love to brainstorm with you, like, how would we kind of communicate to my world, your worldview, in a way that my world could take it in? Like, what would be the thing? What would that look like? That really interests me. I do find, like, I'm eager. I mean, we'd need another hour or two to dig into this question of agenda versus ignorance. I want to understand better how you feel, because there's a lot of people, vocal Christians, who just seem so aggrieved. They just seem, and they just feel so comfortable asserting a worldview on me that's just not true. I just shut them off. I don't listen. But I really want to probe with you. What do you think we're up to? What do you think, like, what are we doing? I'd want to really more richly understand my worldview through your eyes. I've never done that. I've spent a lot of time trying to understand the world through evangelical Christian eyes, but I'd really want to do that. We don't have time to do that now, but I'd love to do that at some point.
Okay. I love that. The idea of how to communicate just a Christian worldview to, media elites, that would be fascinating to me. I would love that. I feel like you've got more to give than I do. I mean, I could guess and make some suggestions and have a little interaction here and there, but brainstorming that together would be awesome. The idea of agenda, it's tough. I think if I had to answer, I would say I think there's some that do, and maybe they're the more vocal ones. But I think at its core, if you hold a certain view of the world, you can't but help write and speak and express from your perspective, especially if you think your perspective is right and the other side is mistaken. So if it's not pushed and promoted through the lens of pushing agenda, in fact, I don't think most people writing in CNN and the New York Times aren't saying, hey, let's push an agenda. They're promoting what they think is true. But when you see the world differently and it's pushed on you through certain powers, it's just hard not to interpret it that way. But I think you're right that there is a more charitable way, human to human, to say what are the deeper issues driving this. And when we understand somebody's commitment on those deeper issues, we can have more compassion for that person because it makes sense that they would approach issues this way from how they're just approaching reality. Right. So,
and then it means we're just part of the world. Like saying a person has a hard time understanding the world except through their worldview. You're just talking about every human being ever. You're not saying, oh, there's this special group called liberal media elite who have decided to crush their opposition. It's, oh yeah, they're human beings. We're human beings. It's hard to get there, but that would be how I would see it, I think.
That's great. At some point when it comes to policy, you've mentioned a couple times that you're in favor of same-sex marriage. I've written a book, Why I View It Very Differently. At some point when it comes to policy, you and I are going to differ and vote differently and argue or, make a case for a certain side because we think it's right. And we should do that as firmly as we can. But maybe there's better ways we can do it that are more humanizing and respectful and caring to people. That's a question that I sensed when you reached out to me. And I feel like we've just scratched the surface on that question today. Adam, this has been awesome. Want to respect your time and let you go. But for those who just want to follow maybe your writing, is there a certain website or a blog or a tweet? What would be the best way to stay in touch with
Twitter, I'm pretty strongly my opinion. But at Adam Davidson on Twitter. I do have adamdavidson.com. It needs some work, but you can read every article I ever wrote. And I have a new business called masterfulstory.com where we sort of walk people through basic storytelling techniques. It actually touches on a lot of the things we talked about uncertainty and how to convey things to people. And I really do enjoy, I don't like hostile conversations, but I really enjoy conversations. So my DMs are open on Twitter. I'm game to talk to whoever. Yeah.
Okay. That's awesome. I hope some watching this will reach out and engage. Adam, hang on. I want to say goodbye afterwards, but really appreciate you reaching out. Thoroughly enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, this was a blast for me. Yeah.
Thanks for doing this, and definitely tell your wife I said hi.
I will. Thank you.